Okay, let me just load that thing up.
So do you have any particular preference about how you want to do it? I'm actually
It's looking at the desktop
Oh, it's on the desktop.
right now.
How do I get this screen to work? Then I have to crank my head around. Is it coming? Yeah, there we go. Okay, good. That's better. No, that one's not there. Okay, let me look at my computer.
Here we go, autoplay.
Autoplay? Oh, there. Yeah, good. Right, you are.
Well, that sounds like I would go.
Okay. Whoops. Come on.
That sounds just right. So,
Up on Windows 2007.
well,
No, that shouldn't make a difference. There we go. Okay, now, let's see. This is the desktop and then home together. Is that the desktop? No. Desktop is there. Goody. Okay.
So all I was prepared to discuss was
Cool. All right.
I'm not sure what else there is. I was listening.
I'll listen to the other ones and then you
Okay,
can
it's all yours.
spend time on the picture. That's the one that was
Essentially, a lot of these speakers on here didn't come from
sure. I replied no. Okay, sure. So you're gonna go first?
However you wish. I think maybe the last schedule.
You are first last. Well, let's see. Let me check.
I'm happy to take your cue.
No, you're listed last, so we should stick to the schedule. We should stick to it. As long as you got it set up. Michael.
And last list.
Yeah, well, that's fine, and it's a panel, so we'll just go in the order of the. I mean, people I think had a chance to read the paper. Yes. That always makes it easier. We'll just go in the order that okay. You lead off. And they got us for 1.25.
Is the name? Okay, so, and I mean, this was my garbage. Ça fait grand-chose.
I think we should start at 4:30.
As reality will take over. So somebody has a presentation.
Yeah, at least two.
Does Holmes have a presentation? Disarmed. I'm disarmed. Hi. Yes. Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. Right, so and I'll send you the little thing I did to have this committee in this. But so Australia went to decision, then raised the environmental percentage. Yes.
No one had a chance to read anybody. It was sort of ad
No,
hoc.
I mean, water lawyers.
No. Here wandering around.
What's his name? Hobbs, Colorado. It gives certainty. In fact, what's his name?
It's Leafy Bank you're talking about now.
the other panel member represents the water users.
Maybe it's just, he was really recently formed. So E cubed is the symbol, but it's actually, E cubed is the name, and E3 is the symbol. Now we have a lot of symbols.
And you know, the government can say, we guarantee you 800,000 acre feet.
The time available.
It's like saying, we guarantee your house will rise 5% a year. You can't do it.
I'm realized
There's no,
from the tail
we don't
end.
have to grow up. We don't have parents who can protect us. That's the change. Yeah, no,
But
this
is your stuff.
because it's, as I said, it's about time for the board.
Okay. Can we reconvene? We're scheduled to go to 5:40, which gives us about an hour and 10 minutes. And I thought that it would make sense to have each of the presenters, each of the panel members talk for 10 to 15 minutes. Then Jim is going to be the discussant for, again, a short amount of time, and then we'll have questions open from the floor. We'll go in the order that's listed in the panel, with David starting first. I don't need to introduce.
Maybe you do need to introduce me, I'm over here.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Well, David, Michael, then Holmes, and we will begin.
Thank you, Steve. I'm not short enough with this microphone, so I will lean over a little bit. But I may just raise my voice so that you can hear me. I'm going to talk today about a very upbeat story. There are lots of doomsday scenarios for climate damage and so on, and I've worked on that stuff too. But today I'm going to talk about a very positive message, which links climate action to economic growth. As you know, California has really been pushing the idea that the growth environment trade-off is a fallacy, and we can prove that with historic data from California. So it's a very positive kind of exercise of looking historically at California's energy efficiency measures and the economic impacts of those measures. This is work which is part of a kind of a suite of reports I did for a technology-oriented NGO, NextGen, and that you can get them on their website or on my website, whichever. This is the thing I'm going to talk about today. These are the more downbeat scenarios for climate damage. But California's experience, I think, is something that can illuminate the path for climate action just about everywhere, although the Europeans have made more progress than the U.S. on average in this way. There's still significant pockets of opportunity for improving energy efficiency in Europe. But what California did over the last 35 years was to basically hold per capita consumption of electricity roughly constant, household electricity consumption, while the rest of the country let it rise about 60%, thereby bringing California to about 40% below the national average in terms of per capita electricity dependence. We did this the old-fashioned way with command and control. No debate about market mechanisms or any of those nice things. We basically mandated standards. The sources of these gains came from three different types of policies. Incentive policies for utilities, the so-called decoupling policies, which gave utilities incentives to promote efficiency rather than simply sell kilowatt hours. Building standards for insulation and other measures that improved energy efficiency in homes, and appliance standards, which basically allowed us to reduce both enterprise and household electricity dependence. The advantages of this for households are estimated to be about $56 billion over the 30 to 35-year period. And so I asked the question, I'm not going to go through the technical details, but this is sort of how I did it. I went back with very detailed input-output data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and asked the question, what would the California economy look like with and without those savings? If California had stayed on its trajectory of, it stayed on the national path of electricity consumption, then it would have been a smaller economy by now. And looking at it the other way around, California created an additional 1.4 million jobs because of its energy efficiency improvements. I'll tell you how that happens in just a second, but that corresponds to $45 billion in additional payrolls for the state. So energy efficiency and growth go together. And I want to remind you, looking back at these employment numbers, these are not green jobs as we normally think of green-collar jobs. These are green jobs across the entire economy, except, of course, in the carbon fuel supply chain, which is what's really financing this. The savings in the energy supply chain are translating into consumption elsewhere in the economy, primarily in services, right? And this generates bedrock employment in sectors across almost the entire economy, except for the energy supply chain. So it's a very different conception, a much broader conception of so-called green employment effects. These are employment effects that result from households saving money on energy and then spending that money on their customary consumption patterns, which are what? Everybody knows, OECD economies, we spend 2/3 of our income on haircuts and espresso drinks, right? These are post-industrial economies. We're spending our money on tertiary, much more employment-intensive goods and services. Here's why this situation works. If you take 154 sectors of the California economy and order them by employment intensity, all these little blue dots, these are all different economic activities in California ordered by employment intensity. That is essentially the number of workers per million or $1 billion of output for these sectors. And there's incredible dispersion in this distribution of employment intensity. In fact, I had to use a logarithmic scale to capture it, because some sectors, particularly in the energy supply chain, have 1/10 the job intensity of sectors in more customary consumption categories, like services, like construction, like retail, right? Over 10 times the job creation from the same dollar spent on output in those sectors. And there was some discussion about it. I mean, in a seminar, somebody caught me on the wages, and they said, oh, well, there are much higher wages in the carbon fuel supply chain. Not true. The wages are all these black triangles. And yes, the wages are relatively high here, but they're not that out of line with services. We know that people in the service industry can charge a lot of money for what they do. But the fact is that saving a household $1 and allowing them to divert it into their customary expenditure patterns creates many more jobs. And that's even before you take account of the import component of energy, right? Which causes a significant amount of that expenditure to leak outside the state economy and even the domestic U.S. economy. So what we call these multiplier chains are much longer in the customary spending areas than they are in carbon fuel supply, right? So this is basically why this efficiency has been very pro-growth for California, and it could be pro-growth for just about any economy. These ratios of employment to output are fairly typical of the OECD, and even in developing countries where there are more labor-intensive solutions to services and industrialization, you see even higher disparities here because energy technologies are much more comparable across countries than other technologies. So just about anybody can benefit from this strategy. Why do we want to do that? Well, this one of my grad students refers to this as the demonic bubble bath diagram. This is why we might want to begin to think more earnestly about this, apart from the growth benefits, because the sustainability issues with respect to energy demand are becoming relatively critical, and they're going to, I mean, we have this demand-side failure right now, but we all know that's temporary. But this is per capita energy use on the vertical axis, and per capita income in logarithmic terms, and it's a sample of 118 countries. The size of the bubble is population, right? So you won't be surprised that the all-time champion of energy intensity is the United States, right? It's way out there in terms of energy intensity. California is actually more like an OECD country. I'll show you in just a second. Oh, it's at the last one. Just a second. I'll show you where California is in a second. But the other OECD is much more efficient than the U.S. Generally, the main reason for this is transport and air conditioning. Air conditioning is a big issue. I mean, air conditioning is much more universal in the United States than it is in other countries. Japan seems to be able to have a relatively high standard of living with only half the energy intensity of the U.S. So it doesn't have to follow this model, and that's why promoting efficiency is attractive. But I think the most kind of telling aspect of this diagram is, of course, the emerging economies. It's just not clear we have the gigajoules, or as one of my sons says, the hecjoules that we need to really meet these requirements in the future. So there's every reason for sustainability purposes to promote the efficiency agenda. California is right here. You take it out of the U.S. It's somewhere in between because of those efficiency measures. So the room for improvement for the U.S. as a whole is still very substantial. I'd love to see a national discussion on implementation. That's the kind of standards that California has followed. But the OECD as a whole could also maybe improve its game a little bit. Now, as far as growth, these are the basic conclusions. Promoting energy efficiency saves money for individuals and enterprises, liberating resource for more job-intensive economic activity and growth. Standards and incentives should be extended nationally using public policy to overcome adoption barriers and innovation constraints. These are quite serious. I mean, we all know that adoption of technology falls short of what we would predict with a rational consumer model, and there seem to be market failures associated with that. The California economy is a good case in point. Berkeley, our city, came up with this great solar panel initiative, which allows you to finance solar panels through your property tax. And bingo, we had inquiries from over 3,000 municipal governments in the first year after this program was announced. So those hurdles, those financial hurdles, do seem to be a significant obstacle, and we need to better understand them if we're going to go for more widespread adoption. Germany has been very successful by using feed-in tariffs and other mechanisms to do this, and I think sharing information not only across the Atlantic but also across Europe might help to facilitate these kinds of small-scale innovations. Energy efficiency is the next breakout technology sector. Domestic standards will establish global markets. This is why the venture community in our neighborhood, the Bay Area, is falling all over themselves for energy efficiency. Because by revenue, energy is the world's largest industry. And energy efficiency can be to that industry what IT was to management. It can revolutionize traditional practices around the world. This will be the next knowledge-intensive sector after IT and biotech. Energy efficiency. The need is so great. I don't need to remind you. Maybe I will anyway. The need is so great, and the potential is so substantial that we can't. Nobody's going to be able to deny the emergence of this sector, and the venture community understands quite well. So how do we do it? Well, the U.S. experience suggests that maybe small capital market failures that we can address. Certainly things like microcredit, things for small enterprises are terrified. AB 32, I've seen this over and over again in public testimony. And I've told CARB that they should really examine the idea of microcredit to help facilitate these transitions for them. They're considering doing a state like that. California is the most successful state in the U.S. for promoting this, and it's relied completely on command and control. I really want to remind people of this, that the debate about market mechanisms is a relatively recent one. Until now, it's all been done by mandates. Even if technology has to be imported, and this is very important for smaller countries, and especially developing countries, even if you import the energy, technology, the energy savings are domestic savings, and they may offset imported fuel dependence. So importing technology, there's nothing wrong with importing technology. Let me show you what happened with California. You can see how, not only how low it is, but how ripe it is. When we began our really determined standards for refrigerators, and they were followed up by federal standards, the energy intensity of refrigeration just went like this, and yet refrigerator capacity kept growing. Somehow, engineers managed to solve these problems. And the price of refrigerators kept falling. Even the energy prices were rising over this entire period. So there's a lot of unrealized potential in these areas, and we need to promote the innovations that will help us overcome these obstacles. Let me show you why other countries might want to do this. Since somebody mentioned the Yangtze River, let's go back to the Yangtze River for a second. This is a little accounting exercise that is really pretty startling when you think about the potential for appliances. As you know, most Chinese households they're on their first refrigerator or maybe on their second refrigerator. So these technologies are relatively up to date in Chinese households. But if China were to adopt standards for their appliance industry, the savings in terms of terawatt hours, just Energy Star for existing appliances in China would be almost equal to the entire capacity of the Three Gorges hydroelectric project. And if you value Three Gorges at the government's opportunity cost, which is wholesale prices, and you value the savings for the households at their cost, which is retail savings, it's almost double the value. So on a cost-benefit basis, the benefits of efficiency are twice the cost of the Three Gorges Dam. Demand-side solutions, okay? Demand-side solution. Now, I'll contrast this. I don't want to give the Chinese too much credit. I'm really, I teach China and the Chinese economy account, and I'm definitely not a China basher, but let's look at the other side of it. This is a supply-side solution for China. China is building electric power capacity faster than anybody in history. They tripled their capacity, their electric power capacity between 1990 and 2005. They're going to triple it again in the next 12 years. And this amount here, the new capacity between 2005 and 2020, exceeds the entire installed capacity of the European Union. The entire installed capacity of the European 25 today, the increment in China's capacity will exceed the today's existing capacity of the EU 25. 87% of it is coal-fired. And these are investment decisions that have a 30 to 50-year useful life. This is the supply side. It's really scary. I mean, this would be a problem, right? Very lumpy investments to very carbon-intensive solutions. And this is the dilemma of the supply-side approach. So I'm really promoting more attention to the demand side. I really think we need to do that. As the patron saint of energy efficiency, Arthur Rosenfeld says, it's the cheapest, it's the fastest way to reduce emissions and save money. And he's absolutely right. Okay, two very good conclusions. Energy efficiency can be a potent catalyst for job creation and growth, and not just green-collar jobs. Green-collar jobs are less than 5% of the job creation from energy efficiency. Not just in new technology sectors, but across the economy. Many of these jobs are what are called bedrock non-tradable employment. They cannot be outsourced. These are service sector jobs. Policymakers love these jobs. In green technology, there's a big controversy, as you may know, about where the job creation will occur. As an economist, I recognize that in the three phases of this technology, first is design and development. The second is fabrication. The third is marketing and maintenance. Phase 2 jobs are almost certain to go to China, just like every other form of high-tech hardware, right? This is hardware, not software. Development may be very skill-intensive. The marketing and maintenance will be in the destination market, which will largely be the U.S. and the OECD countries. But at the stuff in the middle, fabrication, we're not going to reindustrialize America with green technology. I'm sorry, I don't believe that. I've heard that over and over again. I do not believe it. As an economist, why would the cost advantage be any different for making this technology product than for some other piece of hardware? Basically, the IT sector bifurcated between software and hardware. And the software, because it remains skill-intensive through its entire production stage, can be kept at home. It requires highly skilled, high-wage labor. Hardware, no. Design it at home and then build it in low-wage economies. I'm afraid that's what's going to happen with the so-called green-collar phenomenon. But that's fine. I mean, if we capture design and development, the IT sector has been very good to the stockholders and the management and the workers of the United States. But this idea of reindustrialization, I think we have to deal carefully. Anyway, most of the job creation from energy efficiency won't come from that anyway. It will come from savings and expenditure of those savings. Finally, demand-side management has enormous potential for improving energy and environmental sustainability. Incentives and standards are needed. We need the policies that will enable it to happen. There's a lot of technology on the shelf which still isn't fully deployed, and that appears to be because the right facilitating policies are not yet in place. And I think that more dialogue within Europe, within the U.S., and between us can help to create a playing field where these technology companies can really go out and seek the opportunities that exist for them. Thank you. Okay. Let me, well, I guess you can jump in.
I have no PowerPoint. Is this on? So David and I have been making this case for the last 3 or 4 years. And so I'll just pick on some of the points he said and then make some other ones. But I debated the Chamber of Commerce in 2007 or 2006 when the legislation was being adopted. And they did calculations. They said this was going to lower emissions. Their estimate was about 20% compared to 2005, 18% below 2005. And they said 18% lower emissions. The only way we get it is we produce 18% less, and we have 18% fewer jobs and so on, and the economy will contract 18%, and we'll have emissions down 18%. But the whole point, and that is one way, no doubt, of lowering emissions. But the experience in California over 40 years with emissions and with energy use is that we have grown with half the air pollution emissions today that we had 40 years ago, and with the same, as David mentioned, electricity use per capita as we had 40 years ago. This is about changing technologies, changing the way commodities are produced, changing the role of energy in the economy, becoming less energy intensive. If you have sort of fixed proportions, of course, you have to contract everything. But the name of the game has been becoming less energy intensive, and in the course of doing that, as David has been saying, you can get same services for less energy, and therefore by spending less money, and that's what makes for economic growth. The challenge, therefore, in the policy framework is to reduce emissions that way, not by cramming production and employment down, but by changing the role of energy in the economy, promoting conservation, making both households and firms more energy efficient, so they have the same quality of life with a lower energy use and with a lower expense. Now, a major issue is how California did this, and it's there hasn't been enough study of this, and it's really remarkable. The diagrams, the diagram David showed. It's not that there was a gradual separation. California sort of turned around, essentially overnight, within 2 or 3 years. So it wasn't a gradual evolution. It was really a shift, and it's like a culture shift in California. Attempts to explain it statistically from individual factors haven't been very successful. That is, trying to statistically study, say, particular individual regulations and related to the reduction in energy use don't account for much of the change. And I think this was really, as I say, a sort of a culture change. The appliance manufacturers got religion. They just made refrigerators differently that use less energy. Electric utilities got religion, who originally opposed this, but they embraced. And the Public Utility Commission, a separate agency which regulated them, also got religion. And I think customers got religion. I think this was a broad culture change rather than a response of a small number of actors to a sort of a particular regulation. Now, in general, climate change is a race against time, and the outcome is unclear. On the one hand, the impacts of climate change are building up and the effects are building up. On the other hand, one doesn't know how quickly one can change the economy. One of the things that helped California is that it was growing fast, the population was growing, new homes would be growing. One of the crucial thing that distinguishes climate change from a distinct pollution control policy over the last 40 years is this. For the most part, with the pollutants we dealt with, it was possible to reduce emissions or clean up emissions while preserving most of the capital stock intact by maybe placing end-of-pipe treatment at the end of a factory. But we could, and so obviously some factories were pushed out of business, but for the most part, we were able to keep the existing capital stock intact and change how we operated it, maybe change the design of some products, added bits of equipment, and lower emissions. Climate change, CO2 is, the key issue is that we have the wrong capital stock. There's no end-of-pipe treatment for fossil fuel plants. That is, even if carbon capture works, it will be essentially as expensive, it appears, at this point, as building a brand new plant. There's no easy retrofit. We have all these vehicles in the United States, which, gas guzzlers, there's the wrong fleet of vehicles. We have urban sprawl. We have patterns of habitation, which are energy intensive. To a large extent, this is a problem of having the wrong capital stock. And the question is, how quickly can we retire it? And how can we retire it without causing economic damage? How quickly can new appliances, if the new appliances are more efficient, the question is, what is the rate of introduction? If the new homes are more efficient, the question is, at what rate a new home's built? So I say California benefited from a high level of population growth, a relatively high rate of home building. The question is, how will this work in the rest of the United States or in Europe? It may not work as well, but turning over the capital stock is crucial. This is why policies like buying up high-polluting cars or high-energy-using vehicles is true. So it's clear that we can make these changes. It's not clear how quickly, and that's the sort of crucial issue on which policy needs to be focused. I want to end up with some remarks about economics. If you look at the experience, not only with energy, but I would say actually a large part of the experience of emission reduction for conventional pollutants, the experience has not been the way economists model it, and it's not been what economists predicted, and it's not been what economists predict now. If you look at the regulation, well, let me just back up. The conventional theory of emission trading is that you put a cap on emissions somewhere in the economy, and that generates price signals that will radiate throughout the economy, backwards and forwards, as carbon or SO2 or whatever becomes more expensive. And the conventional sort of economic theory, reflected in conventional general equilibrium models, has price signals being transmitted throughout the economy. And the implication is there will be responses, demand and supply responses throughout the economy. Obviously, bigger responses where other things equal, where there are larger price changes, but in principle there will be changes, widespread changes throughout the economy. If you look at the experience of caps for leaded gasoline and for SO2, that didn't happen. There were emission reductions, but essentially all the action occurred by the firms that were capped, and there was no particular downstream reaction. So, for example, power plants added end-of-pipe treatment or switched to low-sulfur fuel, and that fixed the problem. There was not an increase in energy conservation. There was not a switch to renewables to reduce emissions. What's interesting is when the Clean Air Act changes were made in 1990, there were provisions for energy conservation to generate credits in an emission trading system. So it was assumed that energy conservation would be one of the mechanisms within emission trading. That played no role. All of the action was by the particular firms that were regulated. And I think this makes sense sort of psychologically. I have been at committees where CEOs, there was one meeting with CEOs and economists to talk about using prices to control pollution. And the economist next to me talked about using prices or fines. And the CEO on the other side of me erupted with anger. And he said, Chevron will not break the law. Chevron will not pay a fine. And the economist was stunned because he meant, whether it was a tax or a fine, to economists these are the same thing. To a CEO, complying with the law and or violating the law and paying a fine, those are two different things. The point I'm making is I think the caps get the attention of management in a way in which higher electricity prices or higher other input prices don't. And so it makes a big difference in practice, but not in theory, whether you have upstream caps or downstream caps. A couple of closing remarks. I've said this at economics meetings to the irritation of almost everybody else in the room. And one of the meetings in Europe last year, the guy chairing the session couldn't resist, and he said, Michael, what you're saying makes no sense. If you have a cap, the market will clear. If we have emission trading and we have a cap, the cap will be met. It will take care of the problem. Here's what he was missing. Sure, the market will clear, but the price might skyrocket, as happened in the electricity market in 2001 and 2002. Sure, the market will clear, but the price might become very high. And when you have price spikes, there is a real danger that there will be political pressure to put the market aside and to say this is absolutely ridiculous, we are just tormenting ourselves, let's relax the market. I want a market to work, but I want a market that is politically sustainable. And it will only be politically sustainable if the equilibrium price in that market is sort of reasonably low. To get that, I need to push the demand curves and push the supply curves to make them more price responsive, so that we have emission trading, but at a price that is politically viable. That's why in our paper we argue it's not enough to have some sort of emission trading scheme. It is essential to focus on complementary measures which push energy efficiency, which push appliance standards, which push technology programs. Because I think at the end of the day, certainly it's helpful to have a price of carbon, to have a price signal, to have an overall cap. But by itself, emission trading, while it works successfully for SO2 and NOx, it's not going to work for CO2. For CO2, the pollutants, the emissions are diffused throughout the economy. The major source is not a relatively small number of industries in California, but increasingly in other countries, it's transportation, it's millions of households, it's energy use in the home. These are changes which need to embrace the interest and action really of the community in general. A price signal helps, but these other regulatory measures, I think, are essential.
Michael, thank you. So, Holmes is the third presenter in the panel.
Given that it's 5 o'clock right now, can I get an actual time allotment?
5:15.
All right, so I get my full 15 minutes. That's exciting. Okay. Well, I just took it right off the clock. I'm going to hold on to the clock. It didn't look like it was on, so I'm just going to use this one. It's fine. This one will be fine. So I'm starting out my remarks this afternoon with the acknowledgement that the EU and the United States share a very special history, and that is the one of industrialization. The 20th century party belongs uniquely to those of us who have survived the 20th century profligate consumption of fossil fuels. It is actually the use and the harnessing of this energy that has been invested in the infrastructure that we now enjoy, even take for granted, and market and sell aggressively to markets around the world, hoping that they also, too, will follow the same path of development. We finance it. This 20th century picture of our energy profile is shared with Europe, and so is the culpability that comes with it. Oh, no, what in the world? One second. Friends, that's not good. Well, okay, no, that's fine. We'll just roll it. The culpability that comes with it is essentially the security risks that are associated with climate change and its damages, but most importantly, in my opinion, and something I can't emphatically communicate enough in a transatlantic cooperation dialogue, is the culpability. The United States and the EU together handily exceed half of all of the carbon dioxide accumulated in the atmosphere today. It's no secret, and it's not hard to communicate. On any television channel, any radio station, any print newspaper, anywhere you go on planet Earth, it is inescapable if you are carrying a European or American passport in the next 20 years that people understand and know climate change, what its causes, and where the climate change pollution came from. More than half of it binds us together in a dilemma. So the 5 areas of recommendations that I prepared for today's talk for regulatory cooperation are the following. The stabilization and mitigation targets, obviously. International accountability. The use of price-based mechanisms, which I agree with Michael Henneman on his assessment wholeheartedly. The use of direct regulation and incentives for technology innovation. I will try to be brief and fast, but not too fast for those people who have been valiant speaking with us in English as a second language today. I appreciate the luxury of being able to speak in my own first language. So for those of you who have not read the summary for policymakers of the 4th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I highly recommend it. 22 pages, half of it's pictures. The most important part is right here. It says, if you want to have a 50-50 chance of facing only the impacts of climate change that would be anticipated at 2 degrees above pre-industrial global average temperature, that's here, then your long-term stabilization target at the 50-50 line is right here, and that is 450 parts per million CO2 equivalent. The EU actually needs to be credited for putting 2 degrees on the map. The European Union and its Commission put 2 degrees Celsius on the map more than 5 years ago, and it has driven policy discussion since then. Little did we know that 2 degrees wasn't here. At that time, it was thought that 2 degrees would be here in this 550 orange and red line. We've found that the climate is much more sensitive, pushing us down to the edge of what we think is even possible at this point. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has essentially adopted the IPCC's conclusion that under most equity interpretations, that means basically in a negotiation between the United States and the EU together and everybody else on planet Earth, the Annex I countries, which is mostly the EU and the United States, will need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25 to 40% below 1990 by 2020 in order to reach that target. Only the European Union is pushing anywhere close to that target. And if it weren't for them, we would have lack of political pressure here to even drive as far as we've come. Now, these are the countries that have signed the Kyoto Protocol, notably the United States and Turkey are in the Annex I countries that have been holding out. But in Bali, just 13 months or now 15 months ago, those parties agreed that responding to the urgency to address climate change called on them to recognize this target range, 25 to 40% below 1990 by 2020. I think there is an essential line of regulatory cooperation between EU and California and the United States on this issue in particular, because the Americans are still struggling to get on board. Now, I'm an energy engineer, and there are lots of good reasons for that, including the speed at which we can strand assets. I no longer talk about the rate at which we roll over capital stock. I'm talking about the rate at which we actually wake up and walk away from working assets. Stranded assets will be the key to making some of the stabilization targets. And we've been willing to strand a lot of assets in the last 18 months. I don't know why we would stop now. In the case of the United States, in terms of our own targets between now and 2020, let me just put the baseline out here that was previously thought to be our baseline. Now, as of 2 weeks ago, the new baseline. By the way, that is the combination of the Energy Independence and Security Act and the Recovery Act together, along with a reduction of the over pessimistic presumptions of the previous administration. These are the legislative proposals from the 110th Congress, and this is the target range that has been entertained by the American Democratic leadership, Obama, Boxer, and Waxman, that control the executive branch and the two houses of the legislature. They are on the bleeding edge of what's thought to be politically possible in the United States. That's not a good place to be if you actually have to walk a middle path. If it were not for the Californians who are pressing further and further and trying their best to drag this point down from 1990 by 2020 to anything lower than that, and the European Union that's waiting across the pond saying, we got a contingent offer for you. We'll put our commitment down up 50%, from 20% to 30% below 1990 by 2020 if you just come on board with something significant. If it weren't for the EU, if it weren't for the Californians, then it would be very difficult in this town to drag this red line any further south than it already is. This, by comparison, is the 25% mark. We're missing it by a mile. And if you're a gambler, that means double or nothing. If you don't make 1990 levels that have been recommended by the scientists in the IPCC, or they have not been recommended but cited by the IPCC scientists, it just means that we have to do more mitigation faster later. So it's a double or nothing bet to blow off the 25% mark. The recommendation that I would make in this area for the cooperation is investing in science, and particularly including international engagement and encouraging the expertise of scientists in South America, South Africa, and Southeast Asia to continue a commitment to science-based policy and regulation, and to insist on exerting international leadership. It's not just about saving companies, but saving ecosystems. I have been really astonished by the allegiance of the too big to fail ideology without noticing that our ecosystems and planet Earth is also too big to fail. We have a unique opportunity to work together on short-lived greenhouse gases, which I won't have a chance to discuss, but this is an area that is ripe for ready air quality expertise and regulatory cooperation for black carbon and methane. To move on to the price-based policy, Michael Henneman has already described with, I think, great ability what our purpose is in capping greenhouse gas emissions in order to induce a managed scarcity that produces a price signal that deters people from consuming goods that would result in greenhouse gas emissions. We have some benefits to this policy base as shown by our experience. It was a United States policy innovation that was first demonstrated in California markets and actually another EPA program. But it was the EU to put it first to test in the greenhouse gas context, followed then by the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast states, and now still under development among 11 states, plus some provinces in Mexico and Canada in the West. We have seen already this spring a very aggressive form of federal cap-and-trade legislation that's combined with a lot of other regulatory intervention, which I think is important to note. The cooperation among experts and regulatory authorities in these areas has been very impressive. And if it were not for a few philanthropists, the communication between them would have been vastly reduced. So I think we actually have to give credit to some very strategic thinking discretionary spenders who have bought plane tickets to fly people back and forth from these different zones to share with each other their expertise. It's been an essential form of cooperation. These are all the many different terms of a cap and trade design that one has to negotiate, and it's extensive. It's not that much easier for a tax, by the way. But the one that I want to flag here is offsets, because that's a place where the EU and the United States are now inextricably bound in negotiations that are very difficult. This is the United States economy. This is our energy, over here on the left, our energy supply, and on the right, our greenhouse gas emissions. We are talking about capping 85% of our greenhouse gas emissions and calling what's left outside of that cap a source of domestic offsets. Anything that outside the United States and outside non-Annex 1 country, outside the EU, basically in Japan, is an offset also available to us through an international emission allowance. The offsets only drive reductions if they have these following qualifications. They're real, permanent, verifiable, additional, and enforceable. These are extremely high bars to clear, and they require a level of regulatory oversight that is so sticky that the Velcro on every project going through the pipeline makes it all but impossible to reach the scale that's necessary to address the level of transfers, both financial and mitigation credit, that would be necessary to meet some of the global targets. The United States put the flexibility mechanism in the Kyoto Protocol, but it didn't ratify it. Later, the Lieberman-Warner bill included a large amount of international emissions allowances, but it relied upon the EU to certify them all. It was using the EU to launder international offsets. This is a really important form of regulatory codependency, not just cooperation. And finally, this week, we see the Waxman-Markey bill allowing 1 billion tons of international offsets every single year. 1 billion this year, 1 billion next year, 1 billion the year after that, and that's not counting the other billion that it would allow to take place inside the United States if there even were such a supply. This is really an extraordinary scale of perceived potential cooperation on the part of lawmakers. I think don't have any concept of what it would take to pull this off. I'll have to skip this part about competitive industries and leakage, but it's a shared problem that energy-intensive industries may move away from the EU and the United States if faced with an aggressive carbon price, and both countries are moving towards a benchmark or an output-based rebate to basically dampen the price signal in specific sectors, and I think that's a good form of cooperation and shared learning. International accountability is something I feel very strongly about should be a more candid conversation between the EU and the United States. I know that Californians have tried to intervene in this conversation, but it really is actually, I think, at the federal level that it's important. This is the picture of the balance of lending through the World Bank since its inception, where 40% of it has basically gone to the fossil fuel industries. Many of those loans are still outstanding. They are collecting debt payments on fossil fuel infrastructure that at the same time they are simultaneously negotiating to retire. The coal portfolio of the World Bank in 2007-2008 increased by 50%. From its prior year. This is moving in the wrong direction. The official development assistance that is absolutely guided by EU and American leadership has not actually reconciled itself with other policy directives that are being negotiated in other parts of each other's cabinets. The effect of this is here's a population density map of the world and the famous lights at night diagram that phases over it, and you will just see what the apparent discrepancy and disparity is here in Central Africa, Central Asia, all across the sub-Himalayan continent. The moral claims for sufficiency will never subside. They will always be persistent. As long as we are piping B-grade movies and advertisements into every home we can possibly outfit with electricity and a television, we are actually creating a dynamic that it has social psychology that's very difficult to break out of. And the United States and the EU and its engagement with official development assistance really has to come to account with what its purpose is in engaging in this kind of international financing transactions. When it comes to international financing transactions, let me propose it to you in the framework of a climate agreement. This is the climate agreement that's currently on the table. A dramatic drop in global greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, 80% below by 2050, with the Annex 1 countries reaching 85% below. This is what that same diagram would look like if you kept the same global regime, but you apportioned the atmospheric space by per capita share. This is not the actual emissions, of course. This is the per capita allotment. If you subtract the first diagram from the second, what you get is this area E. which is the borrowed ecological space of the atmosphere, that the G77 countries know to a single one is owed to them if you were to talk about any sort of fair share burden sharing agreement for what's left of the atmospheric capacity. And this week the Potsdam Institute came out with a big study that basically said we've got 1 trillion tons of pollution left in this space. And what's available to the Annex I countries is pretty much negative space at this point. The United States and the EU need to be able to cooperate more aggressively, and particularly at the federal level, about what they're going to do to address their own call to account. The Bali Action Plan calls on the United States to come up with measurable, reportable, and verifiable technology transfer, financing, and capacity building. And I fear that we're having trouble coming up with almost any of that. The Californians have to be able to help come through with some good solutions. The last one is not any slide at all. So if I dare, may I move through the direct regulation? Okay. The direct regulations section is very quick because it tells you more about what California's strategy is. This you've already seen explained to you by Professor Roland Horst, but I want to talk about California's strategy of basically moving sector by sector through the economy with direct regulation to back up a price signal. In the transportation area, California has basically committed itself between now and 2020 to reducing 10% below its then current baseline of 2002 to 2004. That amounts to 174 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. This pie chart that I'm going to build for you here will show you where they're planning to get those emissions. Most of it is from direct regulation. This is the vehicle greenhouse gas standards, the low carbon fuel standards, which have been almost ripped by Playbook and Chapter out of the clean fuels regulations of air quality regulators in the EU, and then other measures, which includes regional planning. Again, a place where European thought leadership is very, very important. Mass transit-oriented development and such. Then we have the electric power sector, where in the Californian case, there's actually a lot of leadership that the European Union may be interested in. That includes the energy efficiency standards and incentive programs for allowing utilities to recoup an earnings on investments in efficiency, and renewable portfolio standards, which California has breathtakingly increased to 33% by 2020. The Million Solar Roofs program, which is probably what California is most famous for, is probably the most expensive slice of this pie. And there are lots of other things that have been more cost-effective and should be, I think, better discussed. There is an industrial gas section, which I've heard many people discuss could be appropriate for invocation of the Montreal Protocol. Again, a place where EU and American leadership can really make a big difference. What if we were to try to use the Montreal Protocol to go after the other F gases that haven't already been addressed by those scientists that were focused first on the ozone hole? And finally, after a couple of other slices, we get less than a quarter of the carbon footprint of California that is committed to be reduced between now and 2020. Less than a quarter of it is actually being left for cap and trade. This is a far cry from the federal strategy, which up until now has looked like cap and trade all the way and it'll just work itself out. We're looking for the first time this month at a Waxman and Markey legislation at the federal level that looks like it might actually give us a good third of this pie. We'd have to do it again next year to get another third, and then again probably by the end of next year to get the last third if you want a price signal to bring home the full commitment. But the federal strategy is really quite narrow compared to what we know is possible from EU experience and what we're watching develop in California. These are some of the areas of regulatory cooperation that I expect Californian experts and EU experts could both collaborate on and benefit the federal conversations here in Washington, D.C. And for technology innovation, I simply wanted to add a list of a few policies that I think are important for shared learning. The feed-in tariffs or the renewable energy payments that have guaranteed a market for renewable energy in the EU have been so important to their success. Here in the United States, we have in the last 6 months said, don't worry, we've extended the renewable energy tax credits. It'll all be okay. Who here needs tax credits? Almost nobody that was buying tax credits before has a tax burden to pay for the next 3 to 5 years. We actually are having a financing crisis for renewable energy projects, and having a guaranteed payment stream in the form of a feed-in tariff would be very important to getting some of those projects back in the pipeline. I'm going to finish with this paparazzi shot. These are the Californians that have currently relocated to Washington, D.C. Some of them, of course, have been here for a long time. But if you were wondering about the significance of investing in a partnership between Europe and Europe and California, this is a good slide that makes the case. If you want to accept a responsibility for influencing federal policy in the United States today, working with Californian leadership is an investment that pays off. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Okay, Jim?
Yes. Well, it's always entertaining to bring up the end. And in fact, I find myself a sort of a different wildlife form here in this ecology, because what I am is I'm an economic therapist. And I work, I know, sad to say, mercenary perhaps, but with the higher good in mind. But what I do and have done for a living for 30 years, working through many institutions that you're probably familiar with, is work with countries, states, and regions on how to achieve or make progress towards sustainable economies. And I did Bangalore's strategy in Hong Kong, and even worked in Silicon Valley and many other places. And listening to this impressive panel, which I don't really belong up here technically because their analytic levels are different than my applied world, what I can talk about are two things, and I'll keep it as brief as you would like, but just stare at me viciously if I look like I'm waxing too prolix. There are two things that I've had to deal with in the field as a advocate for both the economy, the private sector, and the public sector. To me, the economy is just everybody, as I say. And there are several issues that we've had to deal with respect to climate change over the years, and increasingly now as these issues reach a moment of tremendous tension. We find when we work with communities and states, they're trying to do what they call euphemistically green strategies, or I'm part of a national group that is doing what we call climate prosperity. And we actually try to do integrated solutions. We try to work with the metropolitan area, which is a unit of analysis that badly needs attention, but is in fact so far doing what we call silo-based green initiatives. And speaking with my regional economist hat on, which my background is that without integrated approaches to helping markets change, all these things we've been talking about won't amount to as much as we would like. When I read Michael's paper, I thought it was brilliant. It told a fabulous history of how we got to these great achievements, but he was right on when he talked about the fact that carbon trading, cap trade, and regulatory tools will not, some of the regulatory tools will not achieve what needs to be achieved. In fact, one of the main areas of the activities we've been dealing with is what we call the innovation pipeline, which is, to use your Schumpeter reference, who I always think, Schumpeter never took secondary consequences into account, so it's one of my biggest criticisms of him. But if you just look at this continuum of innovation from, I use my own jargon terms, so you must excuse me, from discovery, which is knowledge generation, to science application. Development is from technology to product, and deployment, which is from launch to full adoption by the marketplace. What we find is that there's a series of very different challenges that each of these levels face, but they're never dealt with in a continuum. They're always dealt with at one extreme or the other. And what we find when we work with communities, they're trying to find a way to pull down into their marketplace these solutions. So what we've come up with, we work a lot with universities and national laboratories and with corporations. Corporations actually don't see the distinction between one institution and another. Everybody's a supplier. What we've found is that, for example, sometimes you need to create new structures to build a bridge between knowledge, let's call it discovery, and deployment. For example, many of the carbon challenges that were articulated here as needing to be addressed don't have, although I know there's lots of potential technologies, there's actually very serious pre-competitive initiatives that need to be undertaken. I was working with a major state just recently on their renewable energy strategy, and it was amazing how backward the state was and the localities on dealing with pre-competitive issues. They just don't know how to structure them, and UC is much better than most. But the reality is it's different than scientific work. So there need to be mechanisms to pull the knowledge, the intellectual property, and to pull it together with specific problems and create a collaborative that addresses them. And there are ways that universities and their partners can work differently, and I could talk all day just about that. But the next level down is if you actually generate a bunch of enabling solutions, you need to translate them into the actual enterprises or vehicles. You need to develop them into products. So there's a series of major development challenges. Now, I grew up at the Stanford Research Institute, which was a bridge that was created by Stanford University in 1946 between science, which essentially Stanford University represented, and the marketplace, which were the government and industry clients. And what I found in the years that I worked there, and also studying them from various agencies, is that most universities have academic institutes, but they don't have this type of applied institute. They might do real estate studies, but they're usually for their faculty's particular area of interest. But the actual idea of serving as a neutral or intermediate for commercializing technology is a big problem. And I've had this discussion with the California Energy Commission because they have the peer program, which spends a lot of money, but a lot of that stuff doesn't go anywhere. So there's a bridge at each stage from discovery to development. But when you get to deployment, which is really where the rubber meets the road that we're talking about here, we have an even bigger problem, which is most of us who've hung around and participated in venture forums and listened to clean tech. I did a study on the clean tech industry in the Bay Area just quite recently. The reality is that you have this incredible accumulation of it's like bees that all die because the weather gets too cold. There's not a sustaining mechanism that pulls these things into the marketplace. So one of the discoveries that we've made working, doing what we call these integrated climate prosperity strategies, is that you need to essentially recognize that markets do not work efficiently. And there, we've, of course, economists know this very well, but what we have discovered is we have to communicate to local people, and we've done this in different countries, not just in the U.S., the following realities about how you help markets work, which is what an economic therapist tries to do. We help people understand that sometimes you can inform the marketplace and people do the right thing. Don't eat that, it's poisonous. Sometimes you actually have to enable the marketplace by creating some new way for supply and demand to be brought together. And sometimes, even when you do that, the marginal cost is still too high, so you need to find a way to provide an incentive to reduce the marginal cost to make it a little bit easier. But sometimes, at the end of the day, you need to transfer income or use an unusual debt mechanism to get there. So now we're taking these ideas, we're talking to everyday people, bankers, industry, stakeholders about how does that apply to their energy economy and achieving energy efficiency, renewable energy goals. And we create the collaboratives that focus on these things. And the key lesson learned is there's two things that if I can stop right after this actually. If there are two things that I think are absolutely essential that will help transform and accelerate the speed of progress on climate change, it's aggregating market demand locally and creating, I'll use a joke here in a second, but creating a broker or intermediary, a virtual utility, but not necessarily the utility. I call it the Costco approach. Now, so we all know Berkeley very well. I've been working with them as well. The notion of using the bond issue to reduce the marginal cost for borrowings is a brilliant part of the solution. But what Berkeley hasn't been doing is it hasn't been doing anything to aggregate the demand so that, in fact, while there are lots of other 3,000 other places who want to know how they use their bond initiative, the real question is, are there 3,000 people, well, let's say net, maybe 10 to 20,000 people who actually want to use that? But this notion is a fragmented approach. We need to get both supply and demand moving more efficiently through catalytic efforts in communities. We work with localities, we work with states, but at the end of the day, to help markets work, you need to be able to provide different tools, and they might be a combination of the regulatory interventions, like harmonizing the building code standards across 20 cities that are nearby. It might require changes in procurement policy across 20 cities. It might require smart growth policies across a larger region. We just did this for Queensland, Australia, for example. So at the end of the day, there isn't a carbon solution. There is a portfolio management approach, and that by aggregating market demand and creating intermediaries that actually reduce the transaction costs for the supply side, that is essentially make it less hard for an individual firm to sell its product, whatever it might be, you can accelerate. And it's not that you'll have a major hit on any one part of the whole economy. You'll have hits not only across the entire economy, but on a continuing basis. So speaking as at least an aspiring and continuing economic therapist, does research, but tries to get these ideas across to communities, I can tell you it is not easy. And it is the collaborative process that wins the day. We have a saying in our work, which is small solutions, not grand illusions. And we really, really work to that. And I can sit down with people in Bosnia, or in Bratislava, or in Silicon Valley or Baton Rouge, and if you try to help people get a common sense understanding of where they fit into the marketplace, how it affects their lives, it will help them. Now, I believe the feed-in tariffs is a brilliant way. It's going to accelerate change if we get through it. I think we will. But it can't be just done by itself. It will help if it's done by itself. But it is this integrated packaging in metropolitan areas That is the key. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, we still have a little time for questions, and I'm going to exercise the chair's prerogative to ask the first one to all the members of the panel. And the question is this: how do you visualize being able to achieve a political consensus on the sacrifices that are going to be necessary to achieve these, essentially decarbonization of the world energy system by 2050 in the U.S., in the EU, in the other rich countries? Granting that there are lots of opportunities to reduce energy intensity and to save money by efficiency investments, still, you can't decarbonize the economy without there being major transfers of wealth to the developing countries to assist them in decarbonization, and without significant changes in the way things are done in the rich countries. So how do you panelists visualize getting there, given that we live in a political culture that seems to be based on the premise that the only way to get anything done is to promise goodies to every conceivable group and special interest?
Should we take that now, or collect some more questions?
Yeah, just one at a time.
One at a time? Okay. Shall I go? If I can get this thing to work. All right, I'm just going to raise my voice. Thank you, and thanks to our other discussants for very important insights. Let me approach this question directly. I wish I were more optimistic, but frankly, I told a very upbeat story about an easy solution, which is essentially, as I tell journalists, climate policies come in two flavors, sweet and sour. All right, efficiency is a sweet policy because people save money and they're better off for doing it. The sour policies are pay to pollute and clean up your mess type policies, which unfortunately also have to be part of this package. So this is where the public will has to be exerted by, the public interest has to be protected or advocated by institutions. And it's going to be very hard, even on a domestic basis. I mean, California's experience with climate policy is really only going to take us so far at the national level, because the national challenges are much more significant because of the diversity of states' interests. California is easy compared to the national agenda, and the Congress is going to have great difficulty with this. It's the heterogeneity of the states, okay? And it's not a map that you draw in blue and red. It's a map that you draw in gray scale. It's about coal and coal dependence. And in a sense, I think that the national agenda has as much to learn from Europe as it does from California. This is a really stubborn issue. Then go beyond that to the global agenda. And Holmes spoke very eloquently about the challenges there. The hypocrisy of the North-South environment dialogue is old and very well established. Brazil knows that the United States only has 24% of its existing forest cover left, that 96% of all forests in the United States have been cut at least once. And when we dictate forest policy to them, they understand that. I had a Chinese vice minister say into a microphone at a public event, and that one was working, he said, let me make sure I got this right. You want us to pay for the sins of your grandfathers. Have I got it correct? Right? So we have some enormous challenges in terms of trying to overcome fundamental and deep historical inequities to resolve this. And my sense is it will take more crisis. I think fear is going to be the motivating factor. And I hate to say that because I don't like fear as a motivating factor. It tends to bring out bad things in people. But I don't see it happening as just a sort of soothing win-win strategic interaction.
I actually had to step away earlier today to go speak to a group of security analysts on this topic exactly. And I can tell you that the comprehension of negative scenarios is very much on their mind. We don't have a way to sustain emergency responses as a chronic condition. We don't actually have a plan for 200 million people on the move as a response to water stress. The climate will push us to some sort of agreement or absolute inability to agree, one or the other. And there are two very important scenarios in the literature. The barbarization scenario that was written first by the Global Scenario Group in Boston, probably more than 10 years ago now, reads more like this morning's New York Times newspaper than any of the other scenarios that we see. And I think it's extremely, extremely sobering if any of you want to study scenario analysis group. I want to, however, strike a more optimistic response on the other hand by pointing out that Congress is now no longer needed for an American commitment on climate change. The judicial branch and the executive branch have agreed to go forward with an EPA-led Clean Air Act governed response to climate change. It is a fifth best world. It is an absolute it's an inferior response in every way. But that means that we no longer have a do-nothing option on the table. I think that will force the hands of Congress and particularly the Southern senators. I want to point out that cap and dividend is gaining popularity in the United States, whereby we would essentially auction allowances to permission to pollute the sky and recycle money to Americans with Social Security numbers, under the guise that, of course, this atmosphere belongs to all people and not to all companies. But I want to challenge the notion immediately to point out that the sky does not belong to Americans with Social Security numbers. If you ascribe to the idealism under cap and dividend that it's a popular shared commons, then you might actually also agree that a very large chunk of the auction revenues belong to people who don't live inside the United States at all. And that's the source of the financial funding for the technology transfer and the capacity building. It will, however, be a bit of self-dealing. So don't let me be too idealistic about it. Where if you set aside, $30 billion of American auction revenues in a year, it would be used in a fund that basically buys back American-produced technologies that only, are zero carbon and are deployed in other places. So there's some. It's not totally idealistic, the response that I'm trying to offer. I would also want to point out that in the long term, if we do start talking about stranding fossil fuel assets, what that means is that investments in clean energy technologies give you a competitive advantage. And there's no country on earth that should want to continue to invest in fossil fuels if it will ultimately make them a less competitive economy and less prosperous and, of course, more exposed to geopolitical conflict and climate change. I just think that the competitive advantages that are available through the clean energy technology that we see today are actually real, and they will become even more compelling as time goes on.
Well, what struck me during the debate in 2006 in California was that for many of the legislators, there was a degree of confidence. There was the feeling that we have done this sort of thing before with automobile emissions and energy efficiency. In fact, this is what we do in California. This is what we do in California, and it has worked in the past. It hasn't compromised our growth, and it will work again here. That's what actually led me to research the history, because I didn't know what people were talking about, and I figured I'd better find out. Nationally, there isn't that tradition. There isn't that confidence. And in fact, for 8 years, the Bush administration said if we were to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, it would destroy the economy, trash the economy, as the President Bush used. And so it wouldn't be surprising if it takes time to get a commitment from Congress for a major reduction. It seems to me as an amateur psychologist that this will only work when people feel that it can be done, that there are ways of doing it that won't be too costly. And from that perspective, I think the sooner we can get experience in the U.S. outside California with energy efficiency or new technologies, that is the feeling that this can be done not by cramming down production, cramming down employment, but changing the way we use energy and our reliance on energy, the faster it will come. I think this will be a slow process. I think the result is that emissions will rise and temperatures will rise, and we will go way beyond 450 parts per million. But I think in the U.S. in particular, it's crucial that there be a change in sentiment to the sort of recognition we had in California, that, to coin a phrase, yes, we can.
I was just going to say, because I have the privilege of working with communities in various geographic locations, I see a rapid maturation of these understandings, and I also can say that with a good public sector framework, the state or federal law level, the truth is there's no such thing as a national economy. It's the sum of its regions. So we must concentrate a great deal on helping aggregate those markets at the local level to create the momentum that we're looking for. So all I can say is, as they say, think locally or act locally and policy globally or something like that.
Okay.
One question is really important. In the 1990s, I think that the big issue was raised, and it continues to be raised now, is the U.S. wouldn't sign any agreement unless they made sure China and India would be there. I think that the same sentiment exists today. So how to develop a approach that will lead to
let me say, I think this is where a partnership with the EU is crucial. Speaking as a European who's lived in America for 40 years, Americans are big crybabies. I mean, they feel sorry for themselves, and so they have this sort of feeling, you know, if China won't do it, why should we? And for anybody, you know, like in Europe and elsewhere, that is the silliest question. But it is a reality, as David Silverman says. And it may be that EU can sort of make the monetary transfers. I don't mean there's no agreement or cooperation between the U.S. and China, but the EU doesn't have that handgun, whereas the U.S. does. And so it may be that there is sort of partnership in which initially it's not so much that the EU cuts its emissions, you know, vastly more than the U.S., although that would be great, but that it maybe picks up the burden of dealing with China and Brazil.
I agree also that the European Union plays an incredibly important messenger role in this particular skit that David was just playing out. And that is that the United States blew off the Kyoto Protocol, and particularly the members of the Senate. The United States Senate blew off the Kyoto Protocol. They can and should take responsibility for making a casualty in the strategic development of a clean energy economy. They didn't think it was important, or they didn't think that it was worth investing in the meantime, independent of an international agreement. This is where gambles are actually incur real losses and debts have to be paid. The European Union actually has standing to be able to say that in a way that actually China and Brazil and South Africa and the G77 have been struggling the whole time to get it across. I do think, however, that the United States can make a commitment with China's engagement, and China's been thinking about a commitment it wants to make. The Bali Action Plan is actually rigged up to have interlocking commitments. Maybe you're all familiar with the measurable and reportable and verifiable commitments for financing, technology transfer, and capacity building that the developing countries can depend upon or expect under the Bali Action Plan in exchange for their measurable, reportable, verifiable mitigation. And if the first isn't forthcoming, they are not necessarily obligated to come through with the second. And I think this does put the hot potato back in the hands of the United States and the European Union to come up with the cash flows that would actually sponsor the drive for the mitigation that the Senate wants to expect will be forthcoming in an international agreement.
I'm going to finish on Dave's question before we go to another one. I agree with my colleagues here about the general issues, but I do have to chide our European partners a little bit, cousins, whatever you want. We're going to call ourselves in this great mutual appreciation context. Yeah, I mean, the Financial Times, which is not an American newspaper, basically argued that that Copenhagen would be a G2 event, meaning that China and the U.S. had to participate, and without either of them, it would be a non-event. I know that they're both necessary for progress here, but I know that also that the Chinese are very advanced in their thinking about climate response, much more so than you might imagine by reading newspapers, because a lot of their thinking is never published, or at least it doesn't appear until it becomes part of official policy. They're waiting for a better deal. They understand all these issues. They also understand hypocrisy, as I already said. They're waiting for a better deal. And this won't be cash transfer. This will be a much more elaborate long-term engagement, which may involve significant technology transfer, but that could certainly be beneficial to technology companies. Believe me, every manufacturer of nuclear technology right now is clamoring to get their own governments, whether it's Electricité de France or it's Westinghouse, or to get good with the Chinese, the potential huge market for these technology. So this will be, I believe, a more collaborative enterprise as we progress. The pace of progress is difficult to predict. Kyoto is a very important milestone, but let me say to the Europeans in a specific context, I wish that Europe would stop competing to be China's favorite European country. I feel that all the members are basically trying individually to ingratiate themselves to China, and this really undermines a larger interest in a trilateral partnership between the U.S., the EU, and China. I think it really, and China is more than happy to exploit these divisions. They're very explicit. The divisions are very explicit, and there's this intense competition. I think it really undermines the bargaining power of the EU on the environmental front with China.
Okay.
Oh, batteries.
Want to come over here?
question for them. So I would like your insight. And I read your paper yesterday, like one sentence mentioning tax emission is better. That's it.
No, I mean, the tax is like a cap and trade, but you just have a cap at a very high level on energy, on carbon coming into the economy, and you give a price signal, and you raise the price of everything. And as I said before, I don't think the price increase will stimulate, it will stimulate some response, but it will be a small one, and it won't be adequate. I think the crucial piece is the regulatory, the various regulatory actions. And I think in that context, you can combine those with emission trading, I think, more easily than a tax. I don't mean that you couldn't possibly have a tax and a regulatory approach. But I think the regulatory approach can work in one way. You have regulations for technologies, or you have regulations on individual firms or industries, but you always set it up. So if the entity isn't in compliance with the regulation, it can come in compliance by buying emission reductions elsewhere. So it's the regulations, I think, which get the attention in many cases of the decision maker, not the price alone.
I would simply point out that we can actually convert a cap-and-trade system to a tax very easily through the price control mechanism. The price control mechanism that was proposed by Senator Bingaman would have converted his bill to a $12 a ton carbon tax, like that.
And that would have done nothing.
Understood, which is why everybody went ahead with the cap and trade and left Senator Bingaman behind. But we do have political problems with setting prices that are meaningful at all to the technology transition and the commercialization of clean energy technologies. We also find that there are some significant benefits to integration and accessing low-cost opportunities for mitigation through market linkages, if those are ever possible, whereas in a tax situation we wouldn't have that flexibility, and we would actually see that the incentive for technology transfer through the policies not as aggressive.
I think there's time for maybe 2 more questions because there's closing remarks too. So.
Can I just say from a European perspective, we already have fairly significantly higher energy taxes. It hasn't necessarily been the solution, but let's be clear, the mandates of the European community have ruled out years ago the concept of community tax. In 1995, ruled out a non-starter unilateral plan. And many people say that slipping in the cap and trade at its third phase, introducing a significant amount of auction, is taxed through another door. As you quite rightly say, an auction system where the goods go into the same place. This to a certain extent comparative, and that's certainly been the basis on which the member states have argued that we need the emission controls don't have to spend the money they have. So I think it's illusionary to imagine that the tax trust is ever going to be the way in which the European community removes no domestic element of this problem. That should be absolutely sorry for my speaking again. But I'd like to comment about the importance of efficiency, which is what's emphasized in the first speech. I will say this truism, that our government is not efficient because it's big, but it is big because it's not efficient. And the best illustration is creation of Department of Homeland Security, which is nothing to improve Homeland Security on a penny, and spend almost $100 billion for today. And creation of director intelligence, which does not improve intelligence at all and distract CAA efficiency. So, and I'd like to remind you some history about efficiency.
Question, please.
I'm very short, but I'd like to share with you, because you indicated I'd like to share some was designed not on scientific base. It wasn't information theory at this time. It was genius, horse imagination. But I can't speak why he designed this code. How? But many people tried to improve Morse code after. But only Claude Shannon, genius second to none in the 20th century, who designed information theory, and he proved how to do best than Morse. And his pupil, David Hoffman, designed Hoffman codes. I need to say that information technology maybe is the best technology designed in the 20th century, and it will be improve the life of all people in the next centuries ahead.
Okay.
And without data compression, efficiency of information, transmission, generation, recording, all this stuff, if you know such JPEG is compression.
Okay, we have to stop. We have to stop now because the organizers have to make final
I need
remarks
to make the concluding
before we
remarks.
go.
Illustration how efficiency can improve everything, especially government.
Okay.
You want to make a concluding comment?
No, I don't think so. I'll leave that to you. I just want to thank all panel members.
Thank you very
and
much. I was told to keep my concluding remarks to 45 minutes. Well, Joe had written out the text.